Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Josh. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We have a packed hour ahead of us with a lot of information. We're going to get started promptly here in just a minute or so. I would like to do a tech check. So for anybody that is already with us, if you wouldn't mind just sending a quick message in the chat, letting us know if you can see the screen. It's the placeholder slide, title slide. And if you can hear me clearly, I would appreciate it. Thank you, Danielle, Rick, Shelly, Jacqueline. Thank you so much. It looks like we are good to go. All righty. Overwhelming response there. We're really good to go. Okay, thank you so much. We're going to wait about 30 more seconds and let a few more folks filter in, and we will get started promptly with today's webinar. We'll be right back. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get going. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for choosing to spend a part of your day with us here for the webinar. Titled today, COVID-19 HR Guidance and Best Practices, and this will involve some updates. If you joined us on our previous webinar, we certainly will be covering some updated material that has been made available. So we do have Kara Govro that is joining us, and she has a packed hour of information for us. We are going to go ahead and get started. A couple housekeeping items. Inevitably, a lot of questions on whether we're going to send out slides and the recording. We certainly will be doing that after the webinar within 24 hours or so. And we will have one poll here to get kicked off today. I'm going to activate this now. So this is a two-part poll. What actions have you already taken in response to COVID-19? And then there's a follow-up question, just what size employer are you? And this is really helpful for us as we're trying to create content and meaningful information for businesses. This helps us to understand who our audience is. So if you could participate in this, I just kicked that off, and we'll leave this up for just a minute here. So we've got what actions have you already taken? Reduced hours, laid off employees, furloughed employees, applied for an SBA loan, closing your business entirely for the time being. Those are multi-select, so if you've done more than one of those, feel free to choose multiple options there. And then how many employees do you have is pretty self-explanatory. Thank you so much for the participation. We really love to see that. We're at 25%, 27, 30%. I'm going to leave it open for just a few more seconds here to give everybody a chance to vote. We're at 40%. I'm going to try to get to 50. We'll do 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thanks so much for that. And I will share these results just so we kind of see what our audience is looking like. So reduced hours for employees, laid off furloughed employees is the lowest. Thankful for that to a degree. Applied for the SBA loan. So it looks like everybody has been impacted by these types of things. And clearly you're in the right place. We're going to be covering a lot of these issues with the content today. So thank you so much for participating in that quick poll. We're going to go ahead and move into the content. As I mentioned earlier, Kara is an attorney. She is a compliance expert, and she has been spending seemingly night and day diving into all things COVID-19 from the legislative standpoint, compliance standpoint, and she's got a packed hour of information for us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kara to get going with this.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. We're glad to have you here with us today. If you were at this webinar a couple of weeks ago, there are quite a few updates, but there is some material that will be repeated. You'll see actually that the agenda is the same. So if you were here a couple weeks ago, I definitely have some new information on the FFCRA and those leaves that are required. But some of this you will definitely have seen before, so just giving you a heads up on that. We will have a lot of people here today who did not see the first webinar. So all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So first I want to talk about current guidance from the CDC and sort of what's new there. Well, they've got a document called the Interim Guidance for Businesses and Employers. And if you search that term, it will come up first. And that's a pretty useful document. And they are updating it regularly, and they're noting at the top of it what they've updated and when they updated it. So that's super useful. You can sort of just like check on that every morning or every other day and see if anything new and interesting has been posted. And I know a lot of people who are here today have probably already had their businesses closed down by, a state order that only essential businesses can stay open. So some of this stuff will seem a little bit useless, but a lot of the country is actually business as usual right now, or almost as usual. So here's some things to keep in mind. We want to have our employees wash their hands when they come in and probably when they leave, just for their own good, and schedule regular hand washing. So, every hour have employees get up from their desks or leave their workstation or whatever and go wash their hands. Hourly is just my own number. You can make that whatever seems appropriate for you, but more is generally better. Provide disinfecting wipes and schedule cleanings of frequently touched surfaces. So if you haven't scheduled this yet, now is the time. If you don't have anyone who you can reasonably assign it to yourself. We want to make sure this is actually happening. Don't just think of, bathroom door handles, but also sink handles, microwave door handles, fridge door handles. The button on the water cooler is probably touched more than just about anything else in the office. So take a sort of inventory of the things that should be cleaned and then make sure that's actually happening. The CDC is now saying that you should try to increase ventilation with outside air. So they haven't just come out and said it, but if you do a lot of reading on this, it seems that we're sort of acknowledging now that this can be airborne, at least for a little while, maybe half an hour to 3 hours. So increasing ventilation with outside air will be useful. If you can only increase ventilation with inside air and recycled air, that's probably not so great. If you've got travel plans, cancel them. If you need to have meetings, try video conferencing. This is a great time to see what options are available to you. We're using Zoom here, and I know Zoom can be used for video conferencing. A lot of my friends are talking about using it just to chat with friends, so I know that's available out there. If you have to have an in-person meeting, hold it in a well-ventilated space and practice social distancing. So make sure people can be 6 feet apart. And eliminate shared food. So if you've got, snacks in the kitchen that are in, boxes or buckets or bags or whatever, and multiple people have access to those, just get rid of them. It's not worth having things around right now that multiple hands are touching. As for keeping the workplace safe, particularly if you're open to the public, here are some suggestions. To keep social distancing intact, try to stagger customer flow. Obviously, if you have too many customers at once, you're not going to be able to do this whole 6 feet apart thing. So the grocery store that I go to has put circles on the floor, like stickers that you can stand on when you're waiting at the meat counter or the deli counter or whatever, and the circles are 6 feet apart. So they've done something to create that. So, you can think of creative ways to create social distance if you're open to the public. If you can sell your products online, or you can do any of your business online, now might be the time to figure out how. One silver lining of this whole thing is that we're going to learn to do some things that we didn't know how to do before, and I think online stuff in general is going to be pretty high on that list. So if you have some employees who don't have enough to do right now, maybe put them in charge of figuring out e-commerce, if that's something that's available to you. We've got a really wide cross-section of people here with us today. So some of my guidance will make sense for you. Some of it may not. Take what you can and leave the rest. Another question we've gotten fairly frequently that's pretty directly related to keeping the workplace safe is, can we take temperatures or ask employees about their health? So the answer is yes. That's not normal. Most of the time, 3 months ago, taking an employee's temperature would be considered a medical exam and not allowed under the ADA, but we do consider COVID-19 and this coronavirus to be a direct threat in the workplace. So we are allowing medical exams for these purposes, which is what taking temperatures is. You can also ask about symptoms of COVID-19 when employees come in the morning. We know there's sort of a longer list than cough, shortness of breath, and fever. Body pain is coming up repeatedly as a common symptom, and there are no doubt a few others. So you could use that list. What we don't want to do is be open-ended. We don't want to say, how are you feeling today? Are you experiencing any symptoms of anything? Because then it could take us into a disability inquiry, and that would not be legal. Someone pointed out on the chat that you're being told to use disinfecting wipes and they're not available, and I definitely feel your pain on that. On that slide, I mentioned something, COVID list N. Let me actually flip back to it. Yeah, all right, so that third bullet, provide disinfecting wipes or clean surfaces frequently, COVID list N. If you Google that, you will find like a 10-page list of cleaning products that can kill this virus. And it includes things like, pet carpet cleaner that you might have at home. It's a very, very long list. So I realize the disinfecting wipes may not be available for you. I know that some employers are finding them somehow, like my grocery store still has them. They're probably just, pulling their own supply that they get shipped in daily. But do what you can to make surfaces clean. And of course, this COVID list N could be interesting to you to use in your own household as well. And someone also chatted in, can we take customers' temperatures before they come in the door? And, I think you can. They might complain about privacy, this or that. I'm not familiar with a law that would prevent that. California's got pretty strict privacy standards. So I don't want to say outright that that's a good idea. But, it is, if it's a private place of business, you can choose who you offer service to. You could probably make that a requirement. I probably shouldn't have tried to answer that question because I can't say absolutely for sure. When you are taking temperatures, keep in mind, if you're doing this, keep in mind that just because someone doesn't have a temperature doesn't mean they're not sick. So most people are going to incubate COVID-19 for 5 days. 5 days is the average incubation period. So you've got people out there who don't even know they're sick for 5 full days. They don't have fevers, they don't have coughs, and they can still be spreading this. So just because you have taken temperatures and you have asked people about symptoms does not mean that you can scale back on social distancing or, cleaning things or any other reasonable safety measure. So don't feel overly confident just because you sort of check everybody who comes in the door. And that, of course, would go for customers as well. Someone asked about being trained to take temperatures. No, you don't need to be trained to do it. However, I will say that you should be extremely careful that you're doing this in a way that you're not creating more risk. So if you can find guidance online, I actually looked for guidance last week and I didn't come up with any, but it might be worth a new Google search to see if there are specific guidelines about this. But obviously, we want to use something that maybe doesn't touch the employee or a disposable strip. I'm not the CDC, so don't be taking my guidance on this, but sort of, think through it and make sure we're not creating more risk by passing something around or having lots of hands on something that's just going to, potentially spread disease. Okay, let's cover some of the frequently asked questions we've been getting with respect to illness and quarantine. We've answered probably 10,000 questions in the last month or so. Actually, it's probably way more than that now. Almost, I think like 85% of the questions we're answering at the HR Support Center are related to COVID-19. So here are some of the highlights. Sick employees. Of course, you can send them home. And here's something that some employers don't know. You can send home any sick employee at any time if you believe they have something that's contagious. So obviously we don't want to send home employees who don't pose any risk to others. So if someone comes in and they say, I'm anxious today, you should not force them to go home sick. That would be disability discrimination. But if somebody comes in with a common cold and they're sniffling and coughing and sneezing all over the place, you can send that person home, whether we're in a pandemic or not. So same applies here. If someone seems to be contagious, seems to have symptoms of COVID-19, they should absolutely go home as soon as possible. When they can come back should be between them and their healthcare provider, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what current guidance is. If they are someone who has not been tested, which will be most people, then we will just be using sort of a 72-hour timeline to say when they can go back to work. So for instance, if someone seems to be sick with COVID-19 and they go home, you don't have to apply the 14-day quarantine. You'd instead sort of like let the illness run its course, and then they'd probably be told to wait 72 hours from recovery before coming back to work. If an employee is diagnosed with COVID-19, do we need to tell everyone else, or should we tell everyone else? You should notify other employees that they were potentially exposed in the workplace, but you should not name the employee who has the disease. Granted, if you're in a small office, other employees will probably figure it out, because if Bob is the only one that's missing and you send out a letter that says, you know, you've been exposed in the workplace, don't worry, this employee is home resting now, they're going to figure out that it's Bob. That's okay. It's not your job to prevent them figuring things out, but you should not be advertising that information, because you do have a responsibility under the ADA to keep medical information confidential. You'd also then want to sort of do a risk assessment. The CDC, if you just Google CDC risk assessment, we also have it linked all over things on the support center. You will find a little chart that'll sort of walk you through how much danger you're in, depending on, you know, how much contact that sick employee had with other employees in the building. So you can use that risk assessment to decide if you should send everyone home to quarantine, or, you know, people in that particular department or building or whatever. And you can probably also call the local health department if you need help determining what to do if an employee has been diagnosed with COVID-19 who was, you know, recently in the workplace, and you need to figure out next steps. What if an employee calls in sick and we don't know why? Can we ask about symptoms? Generally, this would be another no-no under the ADA, but under the circumstances, it's okay to ask about the symptoms of COVID-19. Once again, don't ask open-ended questions, ask questions specific to this disease. Can we make an employee with a sick family member stay home? Yes, and you should. A person who's living with someone else who has COVID-19 or suspected to have it is either medium or high risk by default. And people who are medium risk are supposed to self-quarantine. People who are high risk are supposed to isolate, like put themselves in one room, in one house. So keeping them out of the workplace is perfectly sensible and also the right thing to do. What about employees with an nth degree of separation, though? So a call we got probably 3 weeks ago was, we have an employee whose roommate is self-quarantining because the roommate's boss is self-quarantining because the roommate's boss may have been exposed to COVID-19, like possibly on a plane with somebody who is sick. Probably everyone in America is only that far from COVID-19 at this point in time. None of us are very far removed from this disease or this virus. So although as an employer, you may have the right to send that person home because you're afraid, the CDC doesn't think that you need to do anything special for people who are exposed to asymptomatic people who had potential exposures to COVID-19. So friend of a friend of a friend, there's no guidance that you need to send those people home. If you choose to send them home, just out of an abundance of caution, I would strongly recommend that you find a way to pay them. They're not going to qualify for FFCRA leave. So I would, like I said, I would recommend paying them. If you don't, they're probably going to sit at home and stew on ways to get you back, or possibly quit and try their hand at unemployment insurance. So just consider that there are some risks with sort of being overly cautious and sending people home who don't necessarily need to be at home. That said, if people can work from home, then by all means, we haven't really put them out, right? They're still getting their full income while working from home, then it's probably not a problem at all. And at this point, I think, pretty much every government, including the federal government, would recommend that if you can have people, be fully successful working from home, that would, help with social distancing in general. What about employees who don't want to come in? Can we make them? Yes, you can enforce your attendance policies as long as there's no legitimate threat and they don't require an accommodation. So if you are in an area with, a major outbreak and maybe you're an essential business and so you're still open but nobody else is, and this employee is concerned about coming in, you can probably require it. But if you have any room for flexibility at all, I would be flexible. See if you can get them to work from home instead. I know that's not possible for a lot of people on the line. I don't mean to overlook you, but for a lot of organizations, it is possible to have some people work from home. So if that's a possibility, go that route. Anyone who requires an accommodation or is high risk should definitely be allowed to stay home. So if somebody is pregnant or diabetic, or they live with someone who's undergoing like chemotherapy, those people should definitely be granted an accommodation, which could be working from home or it could be taking an unpaid leave at home. It's also possible that some of these people who opt out of working right now but feel like they have really good reasons for it, like possibly someone who is high risk, they may be eligible for unemployment insurance under the new legislation. All right, so work from home policies. We're talking about this because hopefully we're sending people home. And I think a lot of employers are trying work from home situations for the first time right now. So here are some things to consider in a policy. And we have a policy written up on the HR Support Center that you can access that covers this stuff, but we want to talk about hours of work. So, probably their regular hours is what you're going to expect from them. If you're an 8 to 5 kind of organization, then that's when you're going to want people online. Explain what you want regarding reachability. So do they need to be on Slack or Skype or Google Hangouts? Do they need to be very, very accessible all day long, or do you really only need them to like have their phone on them or be checking their email once an hour? If you have the higher your expectations, the more you should articulate them. Let them know if they need to check in. Maybe this is with their subordinates, maybe it's with their manager. Maybe it's every 2 hours, maybe it's every 2 days. Just make sure you outline what you want there. And then finally, office expenses should be addressed if you're sending people home. A number of states require that you reimburse expenses for business. And so if you send somebody home and they, stock a full home office to the guild and then submit a request for reimbursement, you may end up with a battle with them and you may ultimately lose that battle. So ahead of time, explain what's reasonable for office expenses. In the policy I wrote, it says you can spend up to $40 in aggregate before you need manager pre-approval. So that's a really low setting. You could certainly make it higher than that, or you could make it 0. You could say every expense at home requires pre-approval. Totally your call, but do outline expectations. A few reminders about pay. So for non-exempt employees, these are people who are paid by the hour and entitled to overtime. They need to be paid for all hours worked, even at home. The only exception is if the time worked is de minimis. And that means the time is so small or so hard to track that it's just really not practical. So 30 seconds here, a minute there, 45 seconds over here, if you send them a text each morning that says, we don't need you, and all they have to do is pick up their phone and read the text, that's literally 2 seconds. So that's definitely de minimis. However, if you're sending a bi-weekly update with multiple paragraphs about the status of clients and asking for them to write back and let you know their availability for the week, yada, yada, and that's taking 5 or 10 minutes, that time does need to be paid. So make sure you're tracking that and paying that. If you send people home midday because things have slowed down, your non-exempt employees may be entitled to something called reporting time pay. So about a dozen states have that, including California, New York, Washington. Oregon has it, but I think only for minors. I think New Jersey has it. So something you might want to check for, again, on the HR Support Center in the state laws section. We have all of that information on reporting time pay. For exempt employees, if you send them home partway through a day or partway through a week, chances are they are entitled to their full pay. So we can never take a partial day deduction for an exempt employee, although we could fill in with paid time off if they have it available. If we send them home partway through a week because we don't have anything for them to do, they're entitled to their salary for the full week. In fact, anytime they do any work in a work week, they're entitled to their full salary unless a couple of things happen. If they missed a full day for personal reasons, like they're afraid to come to work, you could take a deduction for that if they're gone all day and they don't do any work from home. You could also take a deduction if they miss a full day because of sickness and they don't do any work, and you offer a bona fide sick leave plan. All of this gets a little bit absorbed by the FFCRA that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But these are some sort of general things about exempt employees to keep in the back of your mind in case the FFCRA does not apply, which in many cases it actually doesn't. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this thing, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. We've gotten a lot of guidance from the DOL in the last week. The next dozen slides or so have a lot of words on them. I apologize in advance. If you've been to my webinars before or you come to my webinars in the future, I promise the slides won't have this many words, but I know that people are really hungry for information right now, so I erred on the side of giving you too much rather than too little. And for anyone who didn't hear it before, you will be getting a copy of the slideshow or the PowerPoint deck after this, as well as a copy of the actual whole recorded audio webinar. So you'll get all the stuff. You will get copies of all this. So if you're not following me right now because you're multitasking or something I said seemed confusing or there were too many words, you can go back and check that out later. So first of all, this thing takes effect on April 1st. And somebody chatted in a question about, you know, does this matter for the date of a check or the hours worked? So it only matters for hours worked starting on April 1st, or I should say hours not worked starting on April 1st. This is not retroactive in any way. So if someone is on sick leave that would qualify for FFCRA right now, you will not be able to claim a tax credit for that. Starting tomorrow, Yes, tomorrow, April 1st, you will be able to claim a tax credit, but you won't be able to claim a credit for anything that happened prior to that. I'm going to talk about exceptions and exemptions first because that's a lot of the bulk of the questions we're getting right now is how do I get myself exempted from this law or who doesn't it apply to? Then we'll talk very briefly about the payroll tax credit, and then we'll get into the details of the FMLA expansion and the paid sick leave and what they can be used for. So first up, this does not apply to stay-at-home orders. There's this emergency paid sick leave and this emergency family medical leave act leave, and neither of them apply if your business is closed down because the state said you had to close down. So if your state has a stay-at-home order and they said only essential businesses can continue to operate, that does not trigger FFCRA leave. that will absolutely trigger regular old unemployment insurance. And those benefits are pretty significant. They just got expanded by the CARES Act that passed a couple days ago. So if you furlough employees, they have way fewer hours, or you've sent them home entirely for a number of weeks, they're not going to get FFCRA. That's not what it's for. FFCRA is for when you're sick or you're taking care of a kid or someone else who's sick. So if you've got a shelter in place, hunker down, stay home, save lives, any of those things coming from your local or your state government, this isn't for that. There was also written into the law a potential exemption for employers with fewer than 50 employees. So I want to be really clear here. This is not some blanket exemption where you get to say, my business would clearly go under if I tried to give these leaves. Therefore, I'm not going to post the poster and I'm not going to give any of the leaves. That's not going to work. So you need to look very carefully at these criteria to determine if an exemption would apply. So first up, you could be exempt if providing leave would result in your business's expenses and financial obligations exceeding business revenues and causing you to cease operating at a minimal capacity. So this doesn't mean it will prevent you from being at full capacity or even half capacity. It means providing these leaves would shut you down. And because of the payroll tax credit, it's unlikely that a lot of small businesses are going to be instantly shut down by offering these leaves. Most of your employees don't have COVID-19 right now. And I don't know about childcare. It really depends on where you are. I'm located in a state where schools are closed, but the rule is actually that they'll be entitled to FFCRA leave if they are unable to work because their child has their school closed. So, for instance, if their child is 16, they aren't necessarily unable to work because their child's school is closed. So we need to sort of assess these on a case-by-case basis because you're not necessarily going to get a flood of requests. And you know, not every request will necessarily be granted to an employee because, you know, we'll dig down with them and say, are you actually unable to work? Could we work out a telecommuting arrangement or a work from home arrangement? Those are possibilities as well. Another way to be exempted is if a particular employee is asking for leave, but they are so essential to your business that you couldn't live without them. So we've been referring to Karen in payroll. Well, if you've got like a 40-person payroll department, then no, you wouldn't want to say that Karen in payroll can't take leave because you just absolutely need her knowledge of the business. However, if you have a one-person payroll department and it's Karen, she's the only one who knows how to cut the checks or balance the books, then this second one would almost certainly apply to her, and you could say that she's not eligible for this leave. You could also deny leave if you don't have sufficient workers who are able to do a job or, you know, all of the jobs to keep you open at a minimal capacity. Again, this is not full capacity, but if you didn't even have enough people to keep the doors open, if you started granting leave, then you could say, I'm exempt from this particular leave. This is just for the childcare options. Again, I'm going to get into the exact details of what emergency paid sick leave covers and emergency family medical leave covers in a minute, but you don't get to exempt yourself from the sick leave portions. Like if somebody's sick, they get to take the sick leave. This is only for childcare where you might have an exemption. There is a brief non-enforcement period. So basically, if you screw up between April 1st and April 17th, and you promise to make the employee whole as soon as possible, your screw up wasn't willful, and you write the Department of Labor and promise that you won't do it again, then they won't bring enforcement action against you. So that's a pretty long list of requirements and a pretty short non-enforcement period. So they said it was going to be a 30-day non-enforcement period, but they started the 30 days running when they passed the law on March 18th. So really, you should just try to do your best to comply with this right out of the gate, because having to jump through these hoops for non-enforcement looks actually more difficult. The law also said that healthcare workers may be exempted from all of the leave. It didn't say what a healthcare worker was. Well, that definition came out a few days ago. So I won't read this to you, but the long and the short of it is the exemption is very broad. Almost anybody, well, really anyone who works at a doctor's office, a clinic, a hospital, a medical school, a local health department, all of these people are exempt, as is anyone who contracts with that organization to help keep them open. So this could be like the third-party cleaning company, and the person who does their payroll could be exempt because they work, you know, for someone who works with a hospital. It seems very, very broad to me. That said, it doesn't mean that you can't give this leave to healthcare workers. It just really means that if you absolutely needed them to stay, that you could exempt them. So this part in bold, the DOL put this on their FAQs. They say to minimize the spread of the virus associated with COVID-19, the DOL encourages employers to be judicious when using this definition to exempt healthcare providers. So it's not that the IRS doesn't want to give them the money for leave. It's not a money-saving thing for the government. It's that we know that healthcare facilities really need to be fully staffed right now. So if you really need that person to be with you, you could deny them, for instance, the child care leave. Hopefully, if they're sick, you are in fact granting the leave because we don't want them in a healthcare facility spreading it around to all the other people. All right, so how to pay for leave? Well, the IRS has promised that funds will be fast, so reimbursement will be quick and easy to obtain. First off, there's an immediate dollar-for-dollar tax offset against payroll taxes, and this includes the employer portion of Social Security taxes, the employee portion, let's see, basically almost anything you pay in payroll taxes can be written off. And if you end up paying out more in FFCRA leaves than you owed in taxes, the IRS will send you a refund check as quickly as possible. We don't know if that's 3 days or 2 weeks, but they have promised that anything you pay out, you will be paid back for. It's not ultimately coming out of your pocket. We're just asking you to advance the funds. It also says that there will be reimbursement for health insurance costs, which sounds awesome. I don't have the exact details on that, but I think the gist of it is that, you know, if the employee is out on leave, like to care for a child, and, you know, they want to stay on your health plan, that the premium would be covered and there would be a tax credit for that. Draft guidance just came out like in the middle of the night, I kid you not, last night, and I have a link for that in a couple slides. So we just got draft guidance from the IRS, so there is more information on all of this available, but it's like 7 pages long. It's pretty intense, but it is out there. And if you're an employer who expects to be using this, it is probably worth an hour of your time to sit down with that document and try to understand it. All right, so I said I'd get into the details of these leaves. We have arrived at that section. There's this emergency FMLA expansion that is specific to childcare. This applies to all employers with fewer than 500 employees. And it applies to all employees who have worked for you for at least 30 days. As mentioned, healthcare providers can be excluded from this, although you certainly have the option of letting them use it if you don't need them in the building. As for interaction with other benefits, this is in addition to anything else you offer. So if you usually offered 2 weeks of paid leave during the year, and an employee uses 2 weeks of, FFCRA leave for childcare, you can't say, oh, well, that was your 2 weeks. I've just substituted the government's paid time off for my time off. There's no substituting, there's no reducing, and you also can't make employees use the leave that you provide first. So yeah, this is just absolutely an add-on. And it can only, again, be used if the employee is unable to work because they need to care for a child under 18 whose school or place of care is closed due to COVID-19. So if the employee is still able to work, even though their child's school is closed, like, their spouse is taking care of the kids instead, then they would not, automatically get this leave. It's when they're unable to work because they must care for a child. There's 12 weeks of this available. The first 10 days are unpaid, but they can fill that in with emergency paid sick leave, which is on the next slide. After 10 days, there's a cap of $200 per day or 2/3 of their regular pay, whichever is lower, and $10,000 total. So if you've got an employee who makes $1,000 a day, they're only going to get $200. If you have an employee who makes $100 a day, they're only going to get $66 while they're on this leave. This can be used intermittently if you and the employee agree to it. So the employee can't just demand to use it intermittently, you would have to agree to that, but that's probably going to be a really useful option. We're not totally sure yet how the pay works out, particularly for exempt employees, like if they're getting 2/3 pay on this, but you're splitting the day in half, how do they get paid for the other half of the day? We'll definitely be waiting for guidance on that specifically. The child care expansion has job restoration rights, just like regular FMLA. However, also like regular FMLA, if their position isn't there anymore, because, for instance, you laid off an entire department, that would be an exception to the rule. There's things, it's specifically for employers with fewer than 25 employees who meet certain criteria. So the criteria are that the job is no longer available because of COVID-19. You tried your best to put them in something equivalent. And finally, you basically promise to call them during the next year if that job opens up. Emergency paid sick leave is the other leave available under the new Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And it has the same coverage in terms of employers. So any employer with fewer than 500 employees is subject to this leave in particular. And this one applies to all employees, no matter how long they've been employed with you. So the child care leave, which is of course much longer, that's only if they've been with you for at least 30 days. The sick leave is available to an employee you hire today. If you hire them today and tomorrow they have symptoms of COVID-19, they are entitled to use emergency paid sick leave under this law. Once again, we can exclude healthcare providers if we so choose. And once again, this benefit is in addition to anything else you offer, and you can't reduce your offerings because this is out there now. Emergency paid sick leave can be used for 6 different reasons. The first is if an employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. This is, like I said before, a point of mass confusion. People think that this is a stay-at-home order. It's not. That's not what we mean here. The governor has not told you to quarantine or isolate yourself. The governor has told you to stay at home. A quarantine is issued by, let's say, the CDC or your local health department when you have come in contact with someone with the virus. Then you are quarantined for 14 days. An isolation order is when we believe you have the virus and we tell you to go into a very small room and not leave it until your symptoms go away for at least 72 hours. So that's what number 1 is about. Number two is if you've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. So this could be a high-risk employee, potentially, who's been told specifically by their doctor that they should stay home. It could also be someone who, for instance, lives with someone who has COVID-19 or had a very high possibility of exposure. They could be told to self-quarantine by their own doctor. If someone's seeking medical diagnosis for symptoms of COVID-19, that's going to be covered. People can also use this if they're caring for someone who is subject to a quarantine or isolation order or has been told to self-quarantine. It can be used to care for a child if their school or place of care is closed and the employee can't work because they need to care for that child. And it can also be used when experiencing other substantially similar conditions. We have no idea what that means yet. We will definitely be posting that definition once we've got it. As for duration and pay, a full-time employee will be entitled to 80 hours of this leave, of emergency paid sick leave. Part-time employees, that's anybody who does less than 40 hours per week on average, will get the number of hours they usually work in a 2-week period. This can be taken intermittently for childcare purposes if you and the employee agree. The DOL has put out some FAQs on that, and there are 3 on how intermittent leave works, and I will recommend that you check out that document, and I'm going to tell you how to find it in just a few minutes. So really good FAQs from the DOL, and it covers intermittent leave. You can't take leave intermittently for illness unless you're working from home, or teleworking, as they like to say, because they're still in the 90s. So obviously, we don't want somebody coming in and out if they're sick. So we're not going to let you take it intermittently when you should be quarantined, unless, of course, you're working from home, and then we're perfectly good with that. The cap is $511 per day, or 100% of regular pay, again, whichever is lower. So your $1,000 employee, $1,000 a day person is going to get $511. Your $100 a day person is going to get $100. And there's a cap of $200 a day, just like EFMLA, for uses 4, 5, and 6. And those are the uses where we're taking care of someone else. So several of you have chatted in. I'm looking at one of those questions right now. What kind of documentation do we need for this? That's a very good question. So at the moment, the DOL says you should consult IRS applicable forms, instructions, and information for the procedures that must be followed to claim a tax credit. Like I mentioned, this 7-page draft document came out. On the next slide, I'm going to tell you how to find it. That has been released, but even on the draft document, it doesn't say what you can ask for from employees or what you should ask for from employees, which is annoying. So we're still waiting for additional guidance on what exactly employers need to collect from employees to prove that, you know, it was right for them to pay out this leave and therefore to get the payroll tax credit. We know that you can ask for proof that a child's school is closed. And that could be a forwarded email from the school district, something posted in the paper, or a notice on the district's website. Any of those things will do. We obviously don't want to ask employees for like a handwritten note from the principal because that's just not practical. Anything that proves it should be good enough. But we don't know exactly what's needed when an employee is sick or taking care of someone who's sick. I don't think that employers will be able to require a doctor's note. You definitely won't be required to require a doctor's note because it's just not practical for people to get those under these circumstances. Again, if you're like in the middle of the country, you're not in an area that's really been touched by this yet, you're kind of business as usual, a doctor's note might sound perfectly practical to you, but sort of most other places, or I should say along the coast where there are outbreaks, getting in to see a doctor for anything right now is difficult. Even in some cases for symptoms of COVID-19, like they might get a phone appointment and there's a good chance they'll just get told to stay home for 14 days. and that's not necessarily going to generate a note. So we're still waiting for guidance on that. All right, here is the slide with the good. This DOL questions and answers on the FFCRA. Last I checked, which was like an hour ago, they had 59 FAQs on there. And they write in pretty plain English. So I would definitely recommend that you check that document out, and you can word search the page. So if you do Control F and type in the word you're looking for, like intermittent, it will take you directly to that area, because obviously it's a very big page. So you can't click on that link while you're watching this in Zoom, but I am sending a copy of this slide presentation, or you can just Google FFCRA questions and answers, and it'll be the very top hit. I would also keep an eye on irs.gov/coronavirus. That's where the IRS is posting relevant stuff right now. And there are draft instructions for that payroll credit that I've mentioned a couple times now at that address. Don't try and type that in. That seems like hard work. Just Google IRS draft 7200. Feel free to do that in a tab right now. I won't be offended if you look away. And that will get you the document. They have printed draft all over it. Like, they really don't want you to take it as gospel just yet, but we can assume that that's pretty good starter guidance. So take a minute and check that out. All right, we're going to talk now about reducing hours or closing and how we sort of deal with employees under those circumstances. So we can reduce hours of non-exempt employees. We can do that at any time, and we only have to pay them for hours worked. So just because you hired somebody on an hourly basis to do 40 hours a week doesn't mean you can't change them to 30 this week and 20 next week and 10 the week after. You can also reduce their hourly wage. So if you've got some workers doing stuff for $20 an hour right now, and you can only afford 15, you are welcome to reduce their wages. Just make sure you give them notice before the wage change takes effect. So you sort of have a contract with anyone you hire, even if there is no formal contract, even if there's nothing in writing. There's an agreement along the way where you said, come work for me for $20 an hour. And they say, okay. So that's the agreement you have with them. If you change the agreement, you need to let them know, so they have the option of refusing the alteration to the agreement. So say, hey, starting tomorrow, I can only pay you $15 an hour. They now have the option of quitting if they don't like the sound of that. They probably won't under the circumstances, but they have the option. If you don't tell them that they had a change in their pay rate until like the next payroll period, or they get their check and it's different, then they've got a wage and hour claim because you just didn't pay them what they were entitled to and what they believe to be their pay rate under the agreement. So make sure you're telling people ahead of time, and also make sure it's not retroactive. So if you change somebody's pay right in the middle of a payroll cycle, you can't reach back for the whole payroll cycle and make them at the lower rate. We need to make sure we're only doing it as of the day they've been informed. As for exempt employees, you can reduce their hours. That doesn't really do anything because they're entitled to a set salary. You can also reduce their set salary. You can implement a pay cut either for the entire company. You could do it for certain departments. You could do it for certain types of jobs. Just make sure you're not being discriminatory. Although this is a little old-fashioned, it's not totally unheard of for a sales department to still be all male and you know, the administrative workers to still be all female. So if we keep the sales guys at 100% and we cut the admin wages, you know, by 40%, that could definitely look discriminatory. If there's a perfectly good reason for it, because the sales guys are working twice as hard to sell Zoom video conferencing or whatever, but the admins are twiddling their thumbs for some reason, we could document that really well and it would still probably be fine. Just keep an eye out for it. Also remember that exempt employees need to stay above the federal minimum wage, the federal minimum salary for exempt employees, or the state minimum salary for exempt employees. So they have their own sort of minimum wage. The federal minimum is $684 per week. Some states have higher minimums of their own, like California and New York are in the $1,000 range, either depending on how big you are or where your company is located. So check for those. And you can't prorate. So if you have an exempt employee who's currently paid $1,000 a week and you want to cut their hours in half because business is slow, you can't just cut their pay in half to $500 a week because that's below the federal minimum. We can't prorate. If it doesn't make sense to pay them at least the federal minimum because you have so little work for them to do, we could reclassify them. So generally, we don't want to reclassify employees as exempt, then non-exempt, then exempt, then non-exempt, because it can just look like we're trying to get around the salary basis requirements. Basically, we're trying to cheat them, by making them non-exempt on weeks when they do few hours and exempt on weeks when they do a lot of hours. So you'd never want to do this on a short-term basis. But right now, I think most employers who are reclassifying exempt employees are doing so sort of indefinitely because we really don't know when things are going to get back to normal. In that case, I do think it's perfectly fine. Like I said there, I wouldn't do it for less than a month personally. And this is another one where make sure it's not retroactive. So if you reclassify them midway through a pay period, make sure you haven't reached back and rolled in the start of the pay period. If you're going to furlough employees, there are some things to keep in mind. I put these definitions here for you. These are not like legal terms of art, but this is generally how these terms are used. So a furlough is when we've reduced someone's hours or their weeks of work. So it could be a significant reduction in hours, that could be called a furlough, or it could be, hey, please go home for 4 weeks and we'll let you know when we reopen. But you're still on payroll and you've still got a job with us. That's a furlough. So employees who have been furloughed, and they could be furloughed because of one of those state directives to close down, they'll be eligible for unemployment insurance. Many states are waiving waiting weeks and work search requirements, and the CARES Act did just make it so that basically everybody who's unemployed for the next some number of months, I think maybe till the end of the year, will get an extra $600 a week, which is pretty significant. So unemployment insurance is better right now than it has probably ever been in the past. So employees who are furloughed should be encouraged to go apply for it. Just go directly to the state's website and start filling out the application process. I wouldn't call them up and ask them a lot of questions. You're going to be on hold for a very long time. Just go ahead and fill out the application. Some employers don't understand that when someone applies for unemployment insurance and gets it, you don't pay for that directly. It's not like the unemployment insurance department sends you a bill for the amount of unemployment insurance people get. You have been paying in to the unemployment insurance fund, if you will, all along. You have a state uninsurance employment tax rate, essentially, and that's tied to your usual turnover. So employers who can't seem to keep people around and therefore cause a lot of people to file for unemployment insurance, they have a higher rate. So employers right now are concerned that because turnover is high, that their rate will get hiked. But it looks like a lot of states are going to be forgiving COVID-19 induced layoffs, possibly all states by the time this is all done. States are very, very rapidly changing their unemployment insurance rules right now. If you do furlough people, you want to make sure you're communicating that in writing. Share any options they have for using paid leave that they have with you. Like I said, they're not going to be eligible for FFCRA, but if you've got a vacation bank or they've got, a couple days of personal time or whatever, let them know if they can use that. And you'll also want to address health insurance options. So This is going to require talking to your broker or reading your plan specifics, possibly sort of following along with state law, because I think that these rules are changing as well. But generally, if somebody stops working, you know, a certain number of hours, they're not going to be eligible to stay on your plan. So either COBRA will kick in if you have more than 20 employees, or mini COBRA if you have fewer than 20 employees. Those are at the state level. One of those will almost certainly apply, or it's possible that your plan will have some rules that relate to furloughs. So worth checking into and letting employees know what the deal is with that. If you can't make payroll, which would be unfortunate but understandable under the circumstances, you really need to talk to an attorney. So what your liability is will depend on how many people you employ, where they work, how much you owe them, how much you don't manage to pay them, etc. You might have a full defense because you don't have any money. All of this, though, really needs to be determined by a lawyer. So if you think you're about to miss payroll, I know attorneys are expensive, but it's probably worth talking to one. And then finally, last slide here. There's definitely some hope out there. I know this is all really hard on all of us. You know, we've been working nonstop to create information to help employers. Employers are having to do the hard work of furloughing and laying people off. I mean, this is a rough time for everybody, but the CARES Act that just passed does look like it has some really significant relief, including for small businesses. So small businesses might be eligible for emergency grants of up to $10,000. I think those won't have to be paid back. The Small Business Administration may also be providing loans of up to $10 million per business, and amounts of that are spent to keep employees around or to pay rent or mortgages could be forgiven entirely. Also, it looks like small businesses with existing SBA loans will have 6 months waived of those payments. And then we've also got some refundable tax credits for employee wages and deferment of payroll taxes. Those last two bullets are not related to the FFCRA. They are additional unrelated benefits. So we can't really advise on this. This is sort of out of our scope at the HR Support Center, but I did want to at least give you those few bullet points. There will no doubt be lots and lots more information sort of all over the internet on the CARES Act and what it provides, but we would definitely encourage you to talk to your tax professional or your banker about the CARES Act and what options may be available to you. All right, we are just a minute over now. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. Stay tuned for more webinars, and also the HR Support Center is packed full of information right now. We're adding things multiple times per day. We've got forms of all sorts. We've got furlough notices and layoff notices. We've got work from home policies. We've got emergency paid sick leave policies. We've got all sorts of stuff there. So do come check it out, and hopefully we can help you with that stuff as well. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of the week.